The night sky, once clear and calm, became a canvas of streaking lights, as if the stars themselves had fallen. The meteor shower was unlike any before. It wasn't a burst of fleeting sparks, it was a cosmic cascade, bright, endless, and consuming. Each meteor seemed to split the sky open, trailing fire and dust. But it was the aftermath of their fall that would leave the world changed forever. In cities, in quiet towns, in the deepest forests and vast deserts, people paused in their tracks, staring up. Children pressed their faces against windows, mesmerized by the celestial spectacle. Strangers stopped on street corners, eyes wide as the heavens seemed to collapse before them. But then something changed. The air grew thick, and a subtle hum filled the atmosphere, almost imperceptible at first, but steadily growing louder. It felt like the earth itself was vibrating, as though it too could sense the impending shift. The first to be affected were the ones closest to the skies. People who stood under the meteor shower began to stagger, clutching their heads, their bodies shaking as though an invisible force gripped them from within. Their expressions twisted into grimaces of horror, and then the visions came. At first, they were fleeting glimpses, fragments of dread that seemed to flicker like shadows in the corner of the mind, but soon they became impossible to escape. The world shifted, and people were no longer standing on solid ground. They found themselves caught between two realities, one where their bodies remained, and one where their minds were dragged into nightmares. In the quiet of a suburban home, a woman sat down at her kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. As she glanced out the window, a meteor streaked by. But it didn't just pass overhead, it tore through the air, splitting open the very fabric of her surroundings. The kitchen walls turned to blackened stone as if the world was being consumed by fire and decay. She screamed as jagged shadows writhed on the floor like crawling insects, their eyes glistening with malice. From the corners of the room, monstrous faces emerged, their mouths opening impossibly wide, as though they were waiting to devour her very soul. Elsewhere, a man ran through a city street, trying to escape the creeping terror closing in around him. The ground cracked open beneath his feet, and from the darkened void below, hands reached up, pulling at his ankles. He looked around in a desperate panic, but all he could see was a city that had decayed into a twisted version of itself. Buildings were crumbling, their windows gaping like hollow eyes. The air shimmered with distorted figures, humanoid forms, their bodies contorted into grotesque shapes, their faces stretched into eternal screams. The man reached out, desperate to touch something real. But his hands went through everything as though the world itself was a mirage. Nothing was solid. People across the world were drowning in their own minds. In every corner, the floodgates of fear had opened and no one was safe. Each person experienced their own version of the horrors that had been unleashed, tailored to their deepest unspoken nightmares. Some saw a land covered in endless seas of blood, with the moon hanging in the sky like a broken eye. Others wandered through endless labyrinths, their footsteps echoing with the whispers of things that moved just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. There were those who found themselves in alien landscapes, vast barren wastelands where their own bodies had mutated beyond recognition, where they were hunted by monstrous versions of themselves. And yet, amidst the chaos, some had moments of clarity, brief instances where they were snapped out of the visions only to be confronted with the real world, if it could still be called that. People collapsed to their knees in public squares, eyes wide and vacant, as if their minds had been torn from their bodies, leaving them in a state of shock. Some were writhing on the ground, screaming without sound, as if their vocal cords no longer worked. In the middle of the streets, others simply stared up at the sky, waiting, hoping for it to end, but knowing deep down that it never would. The strange meteor shower lasted hours. Its aftermath felt for days, weeks, months. Some believed it was a global psychosis, a shared hallucination that had taken root in the collective consciousness. But that didn't explain the scars. People who had witnessed the visions bore marks on their bodies. Etched into their skin were strange, arcane symbols, as though something had been branded into their flesh, a mark from whatever otherworldly force had reached through the veil to touch them. Some of those who had survived the visions found that they could no longer sleep. Every moment when their eyes closed, the horrors returned. A young girl sat in her room, her eyes hollow and wide. She hadn't slept in days. Whenever she closed her eyes, she was plunged into a void, surrounded by shadows that whispered her name, promising to show her things she couldn't unsee. There were others like her who wandered through the waking world in a daze, lost to the horrors that had become a permanent fixture in their minds. In the days that followed, scientists tried to make sense of it all. They searched for an explanation, a logical answer, but found nothing. No radiation, no anomalous readings, no physical evidence of the meteor shower's influence. It was as though reality itself had been altered, bending under the weight of something ancient and unknowable. And then, one day, the sky returned to normal. The stars were once again distant, cold pinpricks of light, and the earth seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The world, as it had been, resumed its daily rhythm, but the damage had already been done. People walked the streets, their eyes haunted, as though they had seen the edge of the universe and were forever marked by it. The meteor shower had been the harbinger of something far darker, a glimpse into a reality beyond comprehension, a world where horror ruled and no one could escape. The memories of what they had seen lingered, whispers that wouldn't fade. The visions had become a part of them, forever haunting the corners of their minds. And in the sky above, no one could say for certain if the meteor shower had truly ended. The stars blinked in and out of existence as though they were waiting for the next fall. The horrors were always there, just beyond the veil, and someday the veil would lift again.